EHCAs! What on earth are they and what have I got to do with them? Let's find out in this series of videos. Hi everyone, and welcome to the second video in the SENsible SENCO Education Healthcare Needs Assessment series. So this time we're going to be looking at the law. Remember to give this a like, subscribe and leave a comment in the comments section below. It really does help the YouTube algorithm. In the first video, we looked at reasons why we might apply for an education healthcare needs assessment. And remembering these videos were originally written for parents, but they've had such a popular viewing that I thought I might as well share them with SENCOs as well on this channel. So bear that in mind as you watch the language that's used on these PowerPoints, but it's really important. Okay. So we're going to have a look at applying for a statutory assessment, and specifically we're going to be looking at the law that is involved in this. And this is fascinating because you're going to find there are some things that you may think were true are actually not. Alright, so the first slide we're looking at then is a series of documents, and this is the law. You'll notice the SEND Code of Practice isn't particularly high up on that list. That's because the actual law that drives all of this is the CAFA, the Children's and Families Act 2014, specifically sections 36 to 50. These are the ones that talk about education healthcare needs assessments and what is statutory in law. Okay, so the other ones that we need to look at are the Children's Act and the Special Education Needs and Disabilities Regulations from 2014, and then there's also some information in the Chronically Sick and Disabled Persons Act of 1970. So some fairly old documentation in there, as well as some fairly recent stuff as well. And of course, don't forget, we've got the Equalities Act 2010 to keep in mind as well. Okay. Let's put the EHCA law in everyday language. Just in case you did miss my first video, schools and parents do not apply for EHCPs. They apply for an Education Healthcare Needs Assessment, an EHCA or an EHCNA. The plan is what might be produced as a result of that assessment. Anyway, what does it say? Well, the local authority must, and that should be in bold, flashing letters, they must consider whether a child or young person has or may have special educational needs, and consider whether special provisions need to be made in line with an education health care plan. If the answer to both of those is yes, then they must, and I would jump up and shout and scream that, but I'll probably go out of focus, so I won't, but I'll say it again. They must carry out an EHC assessment, a statutory assessment. These are the only two questions that a local authority is allowed to ask when deciding whether or not to undertake that EHC assessment. So who can make that request for the assessment? Despite the fact SENCOs will say it's always them, and parents will say it's always them, actually there are a number of people who can make that request. So who can make that request? Okay, it could be the parent, or the caregiver, the carer, grandparent, whoever it is that has that statutory duty for the child. We might talk about foster carers here, however it's actually the local authority who is the statutory guardian, so it would be them making the request to themselves in a lot of cases. Young children over the age of 16 but under the age of 25, somebody acting on behalf of the school, for example the SENCO or the head teacher. But we could also have healthcare professionals. The number of times I read, oh, the GP's told me to apply for an EHC. You know what? Send it back. Tell them to do it themselves. Okay? Because they can apply for it themselves. Youth offending teams, probation teams, CAMS. If they have enough of a concern that they feel that child needs an education healthcare needs assessment, they are capable of writing this letter and applying for it on their behalf. So, is the EHC necessary? Okay, once the request is made and the child has been brought to the local authority's attention, they have to decide whether or not an assessment is necessary. They have to make that decision and communicate it back to the person that sent the request within 6 weeks of receipt. If there's already been an assessment, a proper EHC assessment, within the last 6 months, the local authority does not have to consider the request again and is within its rights to refuse. It's worth bearing that in mind. The local authority must notify the family if it is considering that an EHC is possible. So this might arise if a professional has gone around the parent a little bit and decided to put the application in. Strictly speaking, you're supposed to ask for the parent's permission, and data protection says we should be getting the parent's permission. However, we know that in certain safeguarding cases we may well have actually circumvented that particular requirement. However, at this point, the local authority has to inform the family that an EHCA might be a possibility. Okay, so the local authorities got the application in front of them. We'll talk about what that looks like in a moment, but they have 3 options. They can refuse it. Let's face it, that's what happens 80% of the time. They might have undertaken an assessment in the last 6 months, in which case they're allowed to. They may not consider that the child has special educational needs. They may not consider that information that they would get from the assessment will actually give a greater picture of the child, or they do not consider that the child will need an EHCP. Some of those you can argue back against. The first one you can't. The second option is that they might assess. So maybe the initial request wasn't accompanied by enough information, or maybe the information from other sources isn't quite what we needed it to be. Well, in that case, that usually goes to mediation. You would send that straight back and say, actually, no, we want you to consider it again and here's some more information for you. Or the third option is the local authority rolls over and goes, yeah, sure, no problem, we'll assess that child for you. In which case they will then undertake a full assessment of needs. If they think that special educational provision in the form of an EHCP is needed, the local authority will notify the parent or the child and young person, the health service, local authority officers responsible for the social care of children and young people with SEN, and that one can cause alarm bells with parents, and the head teacher of any educational setting that they attend. They're required to involve families from the earliest possible stage. Just to go back to that social care one, what most parents don't realise is that there is actually a disabled social care team. And as soon as they hear the word social care, they assume they're going to have their child taken away from them or that they've done something wrong. It's actually an entirely different team. Think more children in need, disabilities, that kind of thing, rather than our let's take the child out of the family and put everybody in prison type social workers. So the local authority says, yeah, okay, we'll do that assessment. What they then need to do is to gather its own evidence. Now, actually, they only have to consider those 2 questions, but the answer to them both must be yes. Whether or not they have a special educational need, and if special provisions need to be made within an education health care plan. They're probably going to be asking the SENCO for a lot of information at this point, but they're also going to be approaching the parents. And if there are any professionals involved, then they're going to want information from them too. Okay, so who are we going to ask for information from? Well, we've got the education provider. That's you, the SENCO. Right? We've got their educational attainment. So you're going to be doing a lot of chasing around, finding out their academic attainment, their developmental milestones, their rate of progress. And I know that some people on Facebook and on Twitter will advise you don't need to send all this information. Well, no, you don't need to send all this information. It isn't statutory that you send it. However, if they're agreeing to assess, let's help the local authority get through that stage. And without that information, they're not going to be able to do it. We want evidence that progress has been made as a result of considerable intervention above and beyond what is normally provided. Or we want to show that even with that intervention, that they're not making progress. We need to know about the nature and the context of their SEN, and we need to look at their physical, social and emotional development, along with any actions that have been taken. This is where that idea of having 2 assess, plan, do, review cycles in place before you put in an application comes from. You can't say a child has SEN if you haven't actually tried to address their SEN first. Okay, so the local authority law and the real law. All right, in the Code of Practice, local authorities have been told they may develop their own criteria as guidelines to help them decide if an assessment or plan is necessary. But it also says they must be prepared to depart from those criteria. They're not allowed to apply blanket policies to groups of children or needs. So if they've got if they've got dyslexia, they can't say, no, we don't assess children because they've got dyslexia. Okay, and they have to take information from others. They're not allowed to demand certain things. Commonly, the local authority will try to tell you their law. Some examples include, you must demonstrate that you have spent £6,000 or some other notional figure on that child. Well, no, you don't. I have another video on that somewhere around funding for SEN pupils. Have a look at it. They might say, you must have 3 cycles of assess, plan, do, review. No, you do not. Although, back to what I said previously, if you're not doing anything at all for the child, then you're not really addressing their needs, so it would be sensible to have something in there. They also might say that you, as a school, must commission the report from the education psychologist. Actually, no, you do not. In the Code of Practice, it is very, very clear that that is the responsibility of the local authority. You do not have to pay for or commission that education psychologist report. It is a part of the EHCA assessment. None of those things are required to initiate that assessment. So you now have an idea of the actual law around education healthcare needs assessments and what a local authority can or cannot request that you do. You're now ready to get that letter written requesting the assessment. Now, remember, if your local authority is one that requires you to fill in a particular set of paperwork, then you're probably going to have to go with that. However, if you want to send a letter or you don't have any of that paperwork, the next video will help you out with that. And even if you are someone who has to fill in a particular local authority form, the next video may still give you some ideas of things that you might want to include. Good luck, everyone. See you later.